You are listening to EE Times On Air, and this is EE Times Current. For Eric Singer, I'm Taylor Marvin. Welcome to Brains and Machines, a deep dive into neuromorphic engineering and biologically inspired technology. In this special episode, Dr. Sunny Bains of University College London and Dr. Giulia D'Angelo of the Czech Technical University in Prague talk to 4 early career researchers about their work.
Welcome to Brains and Machines. I am Giulia D'Angelo.
And I'm Sunny Bains.
In today's episode, Sunny and I will be talking to Dr. Kenneth Stewart, Dr. Laura Kriener, Jens Pedersen, and Dr. Fabrizio Ottati about learning rules for spiky neural networks, using primitives to represent computations to be implemented on neuromorphic hardware, and the advantages and disadvantages of the neuromorphic engineering. The 4 approach the problem from different points of view. Kenneth and Laura strive to understand the important rules involved in learning networks, while Fabrizio and Jens are addressing problems and providing solutions at deeper layers in the technology stack.
Our first guest is Dr. Kenneth Stewart, a computer scientist at the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C. He's been working on one-shot learning, few-shot learning, and learning to learn. I caught up with him at the Capocaccia workshop towards neuromorphic intelligence last year. Kenneth Stewart, welcome to Brains and Machines. Can you tell me a little bit about your academic background and how you got interested in machine learning, and specifically neuromorphic approaches to machine learning?
So I was always interested in robots and artificial intelligence and this idea of bringing intelligence and cognition to computers. And so I did in undergrad, I did a minor in cognitive science. I took courses in artificial intelligence and machine learning and got involved in undergraduate research in projects related to machine learning as a senior. I saw where the gaps were, right? At the time, it was 2016, 17, where deep learning was starting to take off. People were looking at these convolutional neural network models, and those were heavily inspired by our own visual systems, but they could only learn from what data you gave it. What it was missing was that sort of dynamic or interactive aspect of learning. That's where I stumbled upon neuromorphic computing when I was trying to think about where to go for grad school. And so I found UCI and I found Emre Nefci, and he's been a long-time researcher in neuromorphic. And so I thought, it'd be really cool to work for him. And fortunately, it worked out where I got to do that.
So talk about that project and how it illuminated these gaps.
So I did this really interesting undergraduate research project with a professor in computer science. Her goal was to make a robot that could learn tasks from a human. The target was these household tasks, right? Like folding a t-shirt or say making tea. So the idea, I was looking a lot at the time at computer vision. So I would make a computer vision model that the robot could then understand, visually the world. And then I worked with a couple undergraduates who were looking at natural language processing. And so the idea was to combine our expertise to create a system where a human could, by interacting with certain objects on a table, be able to teach a robot how to do some sort of recipe, like making tea. So the human would explain, when I pick up this kettle, I pour water under a cup. And so by doing those actions, the robot could then learn. But the problem at the time was that with deep learning, they can't really do this sort of interactive online learning that is required for a task like this. It only knows what it knows at the time of deployment. And so that's the gap that I was looking at trying to fill in my Ph.D.
So you went to work at UC Irvine with Emre Nefci, and he was working on surrogate gradient descent and spiking networks. Explain now how surrogate gradient descent was a really important idea and made things possible in spiking networks that weren't possible before.
One of the successful things in deep learning is you have to do a gradient descent to learn. It's basically solving this optimization problem. You have these multiple layers in a neural network. There's an output of an error, and then you have to basically have a way to communicate to each of the different neurons and synapses in that network how to change or how to adjust their plasticity based on that error. And so if you have like this multi-layer network, you need to be able to go back through the layers and update them appropriately.
And people will know that as backpropagation, right? It's a commonly understood concept in neural networks generally, but it's not, or it wasn't previously applicable to spikes.
Yeah, that's correct. And the reason for that is so a spike it's not normally differentiable, right? It's just this event in time. And so you can't differentiate that. If you do, it just goes to zero and there's no information. So the idea behind surrogate gradient descent is that rather than just directly taking the gradient of a spike, you basically create what's called like a surrogate function that is differentiable. It still captures the dynamics of the neurons in the spiking networks so that you can still use the same, principles behind gradient descent for training, but on this non-differentiable framework.
Right. And so that has been important in neuromorphic engineering in that it's made these kind of backpropagation techniques that have already been very successful. It's made it sort of accessible now to those who are working with spiking networks, which are potentially lower power and work with the underlying physics and the electronics rather than treating everything as a symbol and as a number. So one of your contributions has been related to one-shot and many-shot learning. Can you talk a bit about what that is in the context of both this surrogate gradient descent and just in machine learning generally?
As we're interacting with the world, we are constantly taking in essentially data and can really quickly and rapidly adapt to that. But in like a traditional machine learning training framework, you basically just feed in like potentially thousands, millions, now even billions of examples of different data. And so that takes tons of time to training, right? You can't like deploy that, if you want to learn something new in a real interactive environment, you can't just have a model sit there for hours to like learn. And the idea behind one shot is like you learn from just one example of the data. For example, you have some neural network trained to detect certain species of dog, but then there's a new species of dog you want to detect. You don't want to have to retrain your whole network on all the species of dogs and give tons and tons of examples of the new species in order for it to learn. So ideally, you just take what the model already knows, just from one presentation or as few as possible of that like new species of dog, learn what that species of dog is and be able to infer for future examples.
Right. So one-shot learning, essentially, it's a way of leveraging existing learning on the chip or existing knowledge base on the chip or on the system and extending it to new classes and new examples. Is that right?
That's generally, the process is right. You do pre-training. You do train on, many examples. But then the idea is that then you leverage that knowledge to then learn rapidly or in one shot new examples.
So I understand you've also written about meta-learning. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about what that is and where it comes from.
So the idea behind meta-learning is meta-learning means learning to learn rather than just having a very fixed set of tasks or fixed goal from the beginning. To learn like a more generalized representation of the domain or the space so that you can then very rapidly adapt to new samples because you've learned to learn like these different representations in this domain or space. And that relates to one-shot learning because, if you have this model that has a very like generalized representation of features and things across like a domain, and then you see something that's related but still completely different, you can basically immediately infer from like all this known generalized representations because you've learned to learn this type of data or task or domain.
And meta-learning is an already existing known quantity in machine learning generally, right? This is already a sort of field of study.
Yes, it is. Yeah, the first paper on it, at least that I know of, is this model agnostic meta-learning, which is the algorithm I've been working with. That came out in 2017. And since people have been building a lot upon that.
Can you say a little bit about how this one-shot learning and spiking-based meta-learning, how they work in practice? Like, what are the mechanisms that you're using to implement that?
I took the general idea behind meta-learning and this model agnostic meta-learning algorithm, which In normal deep learning, you do the gradient descent, but in meta learning, the idea is to do a gradient descent of the gradient descent. That's why it's called learning to learn. And so it's this idea of what's called bi-level learning. And the mechanism is, you can describe it as sort of like an outer and an inner loop. And one test that I've done that's pretty simple is on double digits. So like there's this very famous machine learning data set called MNIST, which is basically, digits 0 through 9. But let's say you want a network to learn double digits, using that for meta learning and one-shot learning. So maybe you have a network that can't necessarily know every single double digit at the same time, but you still want it to be able to recognize double digits. So what you can do is you can get it to learn the general representation of what a double digit is, so that it can just in one shot learn whatever that double digit number is you need it to know at that time, rather than just knowing at the same time all double digits and then just being fixed on that set number of digits.
Now, you and I talked about this before, and my understanding was that the way that some of this sort of fine-tuning, if you like, of the knowledge of the system, that some of that happens by focusing on the final layer of the network and allowing that to change while allowing the rest of the network to stay fixed. Can you talk a little bit more about that and the advantages of that approach?
Yeah, so I think you're referring to error-triggered learning, which is an algorithm that I've been exploring for this sort of fine-tuning. So the idea is, so rather than just always updating the network, you only update it when there's a sufficient error so that you can selectively tune the model as appropriate to help avoid this problem of catastrophic forgetting.
So how is that error generated? Is it about the size of the error, that if the error gets beyond a certain point, then you start looking at more than just the last layer? How does it select when it wants to go a bit deeper and when it doesn't?
Yeah, that is one way to, I haven't exactly studied this yet, but that would probably be the most simple thing to try is, basically just have a certain threshold, and when the error maybe reaches a certain threshold, then you can check in previous layers.
So the advantage of your technique is that allows people to build small, power-efficient chips, probably for the edge market, and to be able to have them learn on the fly and not be absolutely rigidly fixed, so that if new things become important as you go along, then you can cope with that.
Yeah, and just this idea of, like using this fine tuning throughout the world, or like one project I've been looking at is in prosthetics, where you want to adjust the prosthetics and the movements to like the particular person so they can use it easier and more naturally. Another avenue I've been interested in is this idea of zero-shot learning, where you can learn without changing the weights at all, right? Like that's something that these GPT-type models are capable of doing.
How does that work?
Yeah, so how that works is basically like, rather than just learning a representation, they're really learning contrasts or associations between like examples of data. Let's say you have different fruits, right? You have orange, apple, banana, and then you want to learn kiwi. Like, I guess the model already knows, like looks at like apple, banana, orange, and then tries to see how similar kiwi is to like those other fruits. And then rather than updating weights, it basically just uses what it already knows to infer like what this new fruit is.
You know, when you look at your long-term career and all of the various things you could do, what are the kinds of things that really inspire you to think that you could make a contribution in, or might want to get involved with or explore, whatever?
So in the long term, just being involved in this community for several years now throughout my Ph.D., I really want to see like this promise of neuromorphic succeed. I always tell myself, I've been in the machine learning space adjacent, so worst case, I could just go and do traditional deep learning and machine learning. But I really think that the next step is to make computing more energy efficient, smarter in terms of how you can learn more effectively and learn in more like interactive, dynamic environments. And so these are the promises that Neuromorphic has.
Kenneth Stewart, thanks for coming on to Brains and Machines. Next up, Giulia talks to Dr. Laura Kriener, currently postdoc researcher at the University of Bern, Switzerland. She's been working on a different kind of backpropagation learning rule for spiking neural networks.
Laura Kriener, welcome to Brains and Machines.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
I'd like to know a little bit more about you. So you're currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Bern, and I want to know about your background. So could you please tell us about your journey and why did you join the neuromorphic community?
Sure. So I studied physics in Heidelberg. And at the time, there was Professor Karl-Heinz Mayer's research group, the Electronic Visions, in the Physics Institute in Heidelberg, and they developed the BrainScales 2 neuromorphic system. So when I was looking for a place to do my bachelor thesis, there was this event where all or many professors from different institutes talked about their research groups and introduced them. And I happened to be in the session where Professor Mayer was giving his talk. And after these 15 minutes of talk, I guess you could say I was hooked. The decision was done. I attended his lecture on brain-inspired computing. I did my bachelor thesis in the Electronic Visions group. And later I came back for my master's thesis with the same group. And then for my Ph.D., I moved to Mihai Petrovic's group at the University of Bern. And that group, they don't build neuromorphic chips, or we don't build neuromorphic chips ourselves, but rather it's more focused on the algorithmic and the network part. But I've always been in that group one of the people very much focused on getting the algorithms that we develop there and getting the networks actually running on neuromorphic hardware.
Let's talk about your work now. In your paper, Fast and Energy Efficient Neuromorphic Deep Learning with First Spike Times, could you briefly explain to the audience what is the time to first spike coding and why we did not have such a rule before?
Yeah, so I actually would like to answer the second part of the question first, because I think that's easier to explain. What is new about this? And in this project, Giulia and I, so we worked together on this. We wanted to get inspired by machine learning, and in particular by the very, very fundamental and incredibly powerful error backpropagation algorithm that you have in machine learning. And that algorithm has been around since the 80s, and it's super powerful, but people have said all the time, you cannot use it for spiking neural networks. And the reason for that is that the way error backpropagation functions, it requires that if you do a small change in your network, then also the output of the network only changes a little bit. So mathematically speaking, that it's differentiable. Everything in your network is differentiable. But if you have a spiking neural network, then the output of a neuron is either it spikes or it doesn't. So it's a discrete output. It's an all or nothing response. There are no 3/4 of a spike or something. So it's not differentiable. And therefore, people said, well, you can't use error backpropagation. And what we did in this project is we found a way around this. And essentially what we said is, well, if you don't say the output of a neuron is it spiked or it didn't, but rather if you look at when did the neuron spike, then this output can change in little amounts. The neuron can spike a little bit earlier or a little bit later if you changed something in your network. And suddenly everything is differentiable again, and voila, you can do error backpropagation. This is what we worked on. And now I can come back to the first part of your question, what this time to first spike encoding is. So the thing is, if you're now working with spiking networks and you want to do some task, then you now need to somehow encode the information in the spikes, right? And we have said before that we use the timing of the spikes. And time to first spike encoding is one way of encoding information in spikes. I think I'll explain it the easiest with a machine learning example. So let's say we want to distinguish different images of handwritten digits, so the classic MNIST dataset. And then if I have given my network this image, how do I find out which class it has decided this image belongs to? Let's say we have 10 different kinds of digits that we want to distinguish. So we give 10 output neurons into our last layer of the network. And then we say, well, each of these codes for one of the different classes. And then we simply read out the network's response by saying, whichever neuron fires first, that's the class that the network chose. And turns out that for our mechanism of doing error backprop on spikes, this is super convenient.
This work is based on BrainScales neuromorphic platform. And now what I'd like to understand and what I like you to explain to the audience is what's the difference between BrainScales and another analog counterpart, for example, the Dynapse that is developed by the University of Zurich at INI.
So first of all, BrainScales, or BrainScales 2 in this case, which we developed in Heidelberg, is a mixed signal neuromorphic system. So that means you have analog neuron circuits where the electrical quantities within that circuit, so the voltages and the currents, follow the same dynamics and the same differential equations as a neuron model. So you don't simulate a neuron like you would normally on a computer, but rather you have something that behaves like a neuron, that emulates a neuron, and you just watch the dynamics unfold. So this is the analog part. But then there's also a couple of digital parts on the chip, which is why it's called mixed signal. And that's, for example, if a neuron spikes, then you want to transport the information that this neuron has spiked to all the postsynaptic partners. And this is done in digital circuits. This is why it's called mixed signal. The special part about brain scales compared to, for example, the Dynapse in Zurich is that it's accelerated. That means even though the neuron circuits emulate or mimic the dynamics of a neuron, they simply just run faster. So normally a neuron operates on the timescales of like milliseconds, couple of milliseconds, but the brain scales neurons do the same things, but within microseconds. So they are just faster. And typically, like Dynapse, for example, they run in real time, which means approximately the timescales on which the circuits operate are approximately the same as the ones that biological neurons operate on. And both systems have advantages and disadvantages. It depends on what you want to do. In particular, for our approach now, the speed of brain scales played very nicely into our hands.
Now that we understood the ingredients of your work, right? So we understood the rule that you developed, and then we understood brain scales a bit. I'd like to ask you and to give us an overview of your work and the results that you and your team achieved.
So one of the key results, I kind of already snuck into the answer to your earlier question, because just the fact that you can do error backpropagation on spiking neural networks and how to do that is already one of the key results of our work. It's kind of a theoretical result. But then, of course, we wanted to apply this and run this on neuromorphic hardware, and in this particular case, brain scales too. Turns out it worked. So we were able to train our spiking neural network that was running on brain scales with our method for error backpropagation in spiking neural networks, with what is called in-the-loop training, and on the MNIST dataset. And it does very well. It classifies the data with good accuracy, and it does so very quickly and also quite energy efficiently. And so we measured how long it takes to classify the whole MNIST test dataset, so 10,000 images, one after the other. And it turned out that you can classify with our system the whole MNIST test dataset within 1 second. And really, like, we started the watch when we sent off the images to the chip, and we stopped the watch once we had for every single image the classification back on our host computer. And then also we measured the energy consumption while classifying the images. And it turns out that you only need 8 microjoule per image. 8 microjoule, it's kind of hard to judge how much or how little this is. Julian has a very nice way of explaining this, and I'm just going to steal it. He says that if you have the energy that is within one single banana, average banana, then you can classify with this, I think, 30 billion MNIST images in our setup with the energy of one banana. So I think this gives a nice impression on how little.
It is a nice impression. And to be fair, I still remember when you were telling me, Focaccia, how many nights you spent looking at the results to see if it was working. So that's amazing.
Yes.
Your ongoing research, titled Gradient-Based Methods for Spiking Physical Systems, is trying to compare the results you obtained with brain scales with several different approaches. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, our method of doing error backpropagation with SNNs isn't the only one around. At the same time, a couple of others cropped up. And one very famous one is the surrogate gradients by Emre Nefci and Friedemann Zenke. That one was actually also implemented and realized on brain scales too by Benjamin Kramer and Sebastian Biodel. So we are now in the position that we have fundamentally different algorithms of realizing error backprop in SNNs that have been deployed and are running on the same neuromorphic chip. And what we are now very much interested in is what are the differences? We want to compare, like, how do they fundamentally in their inner workings get around the difficulty of non-differentiability, and what are the network structures that arise? What are the dynamics that happen in those networks? So what we want to compare is fundamentally how do they get around this non-differentiability of the spikes? What are the network structures that arise from training? How do the networks evolve during training? And also, what does this mean for the applicability on the neuromorphic chip? What are the advantages and disadvantages of each? And maybe you can also combine the two methods and then get a best of both world approaches.
And it feels incredibly interesting and actually useful for all of us. Now, the last question, I would like to know a little bit more about your future, where your research will go, and what you are planning to do next.
For the very near future, I'm very much interested in the project that I just described, because even though we have now these multiple methods for training spiking neural networks, they are still way more finicky to train and harder to control than normal ANNs that are trained with backprop. And I think if we can understand in a deeper way how our methods for training the SNNs actually function, how they compare to each other, maybe we can learn a thing or two about why is it that the SNNs are harder to train and harder to control. And maybe from this understanding, this allows us to actually solve these problems and make them easier to train and make them easier to control. But also from a bigger picture, I think the results that I have described by now are very much on fairly simple data sets and also data sets that are on short timescales or even static images. And the reason for that is that these are the easiest setups. And if you develop new algorithms and methods, you for sure want to start with the easier setup and not make your life harder than necessary by immediately going to the complex task. But generally, it's accepted that we think that the SNNs have their advantages when they operate on more temporally rich and more complex tasks. And this is where we expect them to be actually better than ANNs. But in that area, it is very much still unclear. So for example, what kind of data is that really where the SNNs are better? If I have that kind of data, how do I encode it into spikes? If the data changes, do I need to change the encoding? What kind of network structures are good for training on this kind of data? And also, maybe I can give my SNN even more temporal computational power by, for example, changing the neuron dynamics or also changing, for example, synaptic transmission delays and things like that. And I think this is very much still out in the open and people start exploring this, but I think it's very necessary that we start exploring because this will show us the way where or if SNNs actually have a proper computational advantage on something.
Laura Kriener, thanks for taking part of the Brains and Machines podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Giulia. It's really interesting to hear about these two different approaches back to back and to hear that they're both running successfully on the same hardware. In the next interview, Giulia talks to Jens Pedersen, a Ph.D. student at the Royal Institute of Technology, that's the KTH in Stockholm, Sweden. He's working on a way to provide an intermediate representation between the software and hardware layers to make it easier to use and design neuromorphic systems.
Jens Pedersen, welcome to Brains and Machines.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Giulia.
So tell me a bit about you, about your background. I know you have a peculiar academic path, but most importantly, why did you join the neuromorphic community?
So I actually started with a degree in political science, and I realized that was a mistake. I think political science is extremely fascinating. But I decided to shift gear to computer science, which was a tremendous opportunity to understand the notion of computation and really getting a better idea of how we compute and how we make intelligence work for us. And that's a very broad notion, but I think the term intelligence is something I've been interested in since childhood. I was curious about this term. What is it? How do you define it? And I realized not a lot of people have great answers. So I realized that I think there's a need for people to really dive into the physics of the world and understand how brains and machines, speaking of this beautiful podcast title, are doing it, right? How do these nervous systems create this beautiful, intelligent organization? And so that really drove my search from computer science. My master thesis was on neural systems, and I discovered these spiky neural systems, and I found out, okay, they're pretty close to biology. And that led me to neuromorphic engineering. And then I met my PI, Jörg Conrad, in a conference in Munich in the Human Brain Project program, who was a part of. And he did a wonderful lecture where he talked about, okay, we can take these spiky networks and we can fuse them with machines. We can build robots with this intelligence. that spoke to me. It's fundamentally different, I think, than a lot of what's happening in the deep learning field right now when you have all these very big, large language models. Because the neuromorphic intelligence that I'm interested in is very practical, it's very low level in the physical sense. You're really trying to engage with the real physical world as it is, not as it's curated in some kind of high dimensional embedded vector space in large language systems.
So you are doing a PhD now where?
I'm a PhD student at the KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden, in the Neurocomputing Systems Lab led by Jörg Konrad. It's a very fascinating place. It's a little cold and dark at times, but we have a wonderful lab with a lot of neuromorphic gadgets and electronics tinkering that you might want to do to study these systems. And I'm close to finishing, so I'm handing in half a year or so.
Let's start talking about your work. So your paper is mentioning a problem with which I resonate a lot. In our community, we have too many software and hardware solutions with their unique technologies, which make it difficult to have reproducible results. Can you expand a bit for the listeners? What is this problem and what is causing to us as researchers?
I actually want to go back in time a little bit because there's a wonderful theoretician called von Neumann, many listeners are probably familiar with him, who actually wrote a fantastic book called Brains and Computers. He was already then looking at the differences between analog and digital computing. And I'm mentioning this because this is a very, very, very old problem. But for various historical reasons, the digital platforms really gained momentum. They've pretty much taken over the world. And now we are left almost with the archaeological kind of efforts to dig out the old insights that happened in analog compute almost 100 years ago. Essentially, we're trying to make nature get physics to do the compute for us. And so even von Neumann had many thoughts and notions on how to approach this, but especially here for neuromorphic hardware and software, it's an extremely complicated technology stack to align. So I think it's very natural that we see this very diverse set of technologies. And I think it's a good idea to have that diversity. The problem comes when I, as a PhD, need to sit down and finish some work, right? Because I don't have infinite time to study all these many different systems. And so just like we had to do with the digital computers early on 90 years ago, we have to do the same with neuromorphic computers now, namely being able to abstract that in some way, find like a language, a way to express, a way to model these neuromorphic systems so we can work with them across boundaries. Otherwise, I think we're in a problem, right? The neuromorphic field will stagnate. We will not be able to develop anything because the insights are so isolated to each particular platform.
Now that we understood the problem, we can definitely introduce your work, titled Neuromorphic Intermediate Representation. So what is the purpose and the concept behind this work?
So the idea of neuromorphic intermediate representation, you're basically wedging in an abstraction, in this case, a few computational primitives, we can come back to that in a second. You're wedging that in between the physical hardware layer and the abstract software layer. What that specifically means for us is actually taking a step back to the old days of analog computing, if you will, and then reformulating what we mean by computational primitives. So for digital computers, you have bits and gates that can represent the flow of information, but that's not how nature works fundamentally. Most neural systems, particular in computational neuroscience, are represented with equations that change in time. So some sort of system that when you apply some current to it, you permute it somehow. And that's really, I think, a much more reasonable fundamental primitive for computing with neural systems. And that's what neuromorphic intermediate representation is about. Essentially, it's nothing new. People have been making these equations for hundreds of years. But I think what's new is that I think we found a level of abstraction which is meaningful both for computational models and for analog systems. That doesn't mean that this will cover all possible cases of computational models and analog systems. That's far from the case. There's much more research to be done. But I think this is a first step at something which is declarative, meaning that we have this idealized normative representation that more and more people can adhere to, can understand, can subscribe to. And that means both in the software stack and in the hardware stack.
So with NEAR, you propose to bridge neuromorphic simulators, Lava, Nengo, Norse, Rockpool, Synapse, SNN, Torch, Spikes, and digital neuromorphic hardware platforms such as Luigi via Lava, Spec via Synapse, and Spinnaker too. So I have two questions. And one is, how does really this translate into reality? And why these specific frameworks and not some others?
In practical terms, what we hope this gives to the community is a way to use and describe the same models on different platforms. And I should really point out, by the way, we've only looked at digital hardware for the moment. But I think there's a beautiful point to be made here, because we just talked about how difficult and complicated analog and digital hardware is to build, and that means they will be different. So some hardware platforms will have leaky integrated fire neurons, and some others might not. So even though we have the same language, a way of describing models, they will not work exactly the same on all different platforms. And in some sense, I think that's a wonderful analogy to nature. Even though we might have the same substrate or rough structure in our nervous system, our brains are wildly different. There are room for discrepancies and divergent behaviors. When I say that we want to translate these models into specific platforms, what I'm hoping is actually not to get the exact same behavior, but to get the same topology, if you will, same structure, the same kind of computation. And the hope, of course, then is that with better and better algorithm, that can adapt, that can fuse, that can transform into whatever is needed at a given instance, just like biological systems. And coming to your second question, then why this then and not others? I think because we've reduced to these kind of physical primitives, these naturalistic primitives that are declaring some computation. They're not implementing it. We're not stating how the world should look like in concrete terms at every single point in the execution of the model. We're putting the normative frame around the computation, and then essentially leaving the choice of implementation up to the individual platforms. And I think that's very important, because previous efforts, I think, for instance, Pine Neural Network framework, which has been a wonderful effort to, for instance, bridge Spinnaker that you mentioned with the Nest simulator, something like that, right? That has been very focused on the computational aspect from a digital point of view. It's been extremely important to reproduce the models exactly like they were on all systems. And I think that's a misconception, because that's not how these models will operate when we eventually get the holy grail of analog neuromorphic hardware to work.
So if you could imagine to have one software and one hardware of your dreams, which kind of characteristic you would love to have?
It's a wonderful question. So honestly, I think the hardware of my dreams is already here. We just don't know how to use it. And that's exactly the problem. We can look at nature and we can see exactly what it's doing. We just don't understand it in a way that we can rephrase it into our own problems and solve our own tasks. I think, honestly, we have to somehow create models that are more appropriately fitting the human mind and maybe less appropriately fitting physics. And I know that's a controversial statement, but I don't think the problem here is the physical hardware. The hardware exists and it works. The problem is us not understanding what's happening. I think, honestly, the software of my dream will be able to take something like NEAR, describe all the wonderful developments that's been happening in deep learning over the past years, and then adding to it so we can make it plastic and adaptive. Because then the hardware in principle doesn't really matter.
Now I'd like to ask you the results of this work and what you're working on now and what's your future.
This is actually just one branch of what I've been doing in my PhD. So having a background in computer science, I've been focusing a lot on generating reproducible software environments. I think open sourcing tools is as much a scientific endeavor as generating and researching good ideas. So I spent some time developing a neuron simulator together with Christian Pehle called Norse. It's been a tremendous help in my research. I've also developed software to stream and work with adverse event representation in event-based cameras and files. It's called AE Stream, which has also been a lot of fun. And my research at the moment actually is to try to understand vision from a geometric point of view in neuromorphic networks, to take some of the ideas from group theory and geometry and looking into the spatio-temporal domain of neuromorphic computing. Because I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done in understanding not just how we compute with space. I think that's what a lot of vision models is doing, but also compute in time, because that's essentially what neuromorphic systems have to do. We have to incorporate these temporal dimensions. And next, I'm lucky to go and visit a professor at Stanford, Sadas Shankar, who's taken interest in this neuromorphic intermediate representation. And I think we're more focused on moving that closer towards physics and understanding what exactly does this mean when we relate this to the notion of computation. So we want to expand that and see, okay, how can we bring some of these guarantees from the digital world into the analog world, and how can we expand that?
Jens Pedersen, thanks a lot for being part of the Brains and Machines podcast.
It was a pleasure, Giulia.
Thanks, Giulia. They can be controversial, but I'm very interested in this issue of intermediate representations, so I'll definitely read up about this work. I think I see some travel to Sweden in my future also. In the last interview, Giulia talks to Dr. Fabrizio Ottati, an AI machine learning computer architect at NXP Semiconductors in Hamburg, Germany. He's marking Neuromorphic's homework by comparing artificial neural networks and spiking networks in both static and dynamic scenarios.
Fabrizio Ottati, welcome to Brains and Machines.
Oh, Giulia, thank you for having me.
Let's start from scratch. Tell me about you, who you are, your background, but most importantly, why you got to this field.
Right now, I am an electronic engineer. In particular, I work on designing a processor for AI in NXP. And my background is fundamental in computer architecture. I did my Ph.D. in Politecnico di Torino. I worked on acceleration of spiking neural networks on digital hardware platforms, in particular PGAs. Actually, who got me into this field is a man that someone among the audience may know, Gregor Lenz, with whom I got in touch on an open source project called Tonic. From there, we started playing together with the software for event cameras and eventually SNNs. And there I got to know this amazing community made of amazing people, and so on and so forth.
Let's delve into your work a little bit more. So one of the first sentences of the abstract of your work, which, by the way, has a cool title, To Spike or Not to Spike, caught my attention. And is the power efficiency of the biological brain outperforms any large-scale deep learning model. Thus, neuromorphic computing tries to mimic the brain operation. And in reality, nobody really measured this difference, but everyone would agree with you, right? So my question is, what do you think is the most interesting thing about the biological communication through spikes?
Most people claim the brain is more efficient, and that is actually true, but we also have to take into account the fact that we have been trained throughout evolution. So we have a really strong bias in our model, which is our brain. And throughout our life, what we do is not learn, but simply fine-tune. Just like large language models fine-tune on different tasks, we fine-tune on different tasks of life, with the strong difference that we do multiple things at once and we do it on a 20 watts budget. The advantage of brain most probably is due to the incredible amount of interconnections that is present in it, which right now we are not able to implement in an efficient way in silicon. Mostly because the brain is in a 3D space, and right now we are only able to work on the 2D space when we try to build our computers. Regarding spikes, I'm kind of convinced that they are not the most efficient way of doing the computing for the way our computers are built, at least. But yeah, we have plenty to learn from the biological brain.
I agree with you. You also say that the biological substrate has severely constrained the evolution of biological brain. And I'd argue that embodiment helped throughout evolution to create the best or the good enough structure for a specific environment. Could you expand your point of view a little bit more?
Sure. I am completely ignorant in evolutionism, but what I will try to guess is that the humans tried to do the best they could with what we've got. We have this mass in our head that has been selected throughout evolution in order to do the best things in the best manner and consuming as few energy as possible. That's what we have been trained to do, and that's why our brain, the way we interact, the way we learn has been constrained by our biological substrate. Like we do in our silicon labs, we couldn't cancel our brain and start with a new design from scratch. And that's why computers are way better than us at math, for instance. And that's why we are severely constrained by the biological substrate. And that's also a reason why I think we should not try to emulate too closely the brain. But just getting inspired is enough.
This is an interesting point of view. So you did a smart thing. You asked yourself when and where is really needed to take inspiration from nature. And you compared it with an ANN, an artificial neural network. Could you expand a bit and talk about your work and explain it and summarize it for the listeners, please?
So what we tried to do in To Spike or Not to Spike is to look at a subset of the current tasks that are being investigated in machine learning. And we focused on two. The first one was a spatial task, not time related, which consists of object recognition. And another task was time related, a spatiotemporal task, which in our case was keyword spotting, so audio processing. And what we understood is that SNNs are the disadvantage with respect to artificial neural networks when it comes to purely spatial tasks. And that's due to several things, but the most important ones are that first, a spiking neural network needs time to make a prediction, needs to go through a series of time steps to make a prediction. This involves several computations that are done over and over, where over and over means the number of time steps that you need to perform a computation. And even if you are really efficient in a single time step, you can't make up for it. INN will always outperform you because in INN, everything is static and you don't need multiple time steps to perform a simple inference, which consists in recognizing where the cat is in the photo, basically. When it comes to temporal tasks, it's a different story. In there, we are playing a fair game, SNNs and what we consider recurrent neural networks. That's a fair game because both models need a notion of time to process data. But still, SNNs are lacking performance in terms of accuracy. Main reason behind that, in my opinion, is that we still try to reason with these extremely discrete spikes that cannot encode information in a good way, in my opinion, at least not as well as a gated recurrent unit or a long short-term memory, which are some state-of-the-art recurrent cells in the artificial domain. But we also noticed that at the current moment, our learning solution in this temporal feed are pretty advanced with respect to ANN. In ANN, as far as I know, on-chip learning is performed in general platforms, such as microcontrollers, while there are chips out there that do the full learning. Maybe they are not complicated tasks, but still they perform the whole training process direct on chip from Charlotte Frenkel.
So I see you mentioned that Spike GPT, the first spiking LLM, is estimated to use 22 times fewer operation in its execution when compared to its conventional non-spiking counterpart. And I think it's an important bit of information. Can you explain it to everyone?
What Jason Schrager has been doing is to perform lightweight transformer based on spikes that allows a much less complex computational pipeline to perform much fewer operations. This is an important thing because right now transformers are really prohibitive to be executed in something that it's not a GPU. We are making progress on that, but still they have a complexity that makes it not feasible for edge devices to run it. In fact, there are plenty of works that are starting to come out from linear transformer that translate from a quadratic in terms of tokens complexity to a linear one. And then recently, Microsoft came up with a sort of mixed transformer, a sort of recurrent transformer called retentive networks. So the community is really trying to overcome this huge computational problem because it's not sustainable at the current moment. I read an article some time ago where it was written that a single prompt fed to a GPT-3 model from OpenAI costs 4 cents to them. That's not sustainable.
And could you briefly explain what a transformer is for the listeners that do not know it?
So a transformer gets a sequence in input, which could be a sequence of words, and tries to look at it from different perspectives, which are called the different heads of attention, and tries to find connection between the words that give a meaning to the word, to understand the concept in the phrase. And this is translated to plenty of applications, from natural language processing, for instance, code generation, to everything nowadays, even recognizing cats.
Thank you. And since you are one of the founders of Open Neuromorphic, I'd like you to explain a little bit and briefly what Open Neuromorphic is, what it claims to do, and why people should join this community. And at the end, I would like you to tell us a bit more about your future, or where do you think that this community should go in your specific point of view?
Open Neuromorphic was born out of a reunion among fellow researchers, which were me, Gregor, and Jason. And what this community tries to do is to simply gather people and to make them talk about anything that's worth in this AI domain, from computer hardware in my field to Jason's SNN models to Gregor's space application and event-based vision pipelines and so on and so forth. And the nice thing about this community is that everyone can bring something, discuss something, and start something. And that's what I like the most about the community. Everyone can do whatever they want. And we are growing with a steady pace. And I do think that this is the direction that we should keep, to allow everyone to be in this space, enjoy research, enjoy what's the open source technology out there, and maybe, if we are lucky, making it go faster.
Fabrizio Ottati, thanks for being with us in Brains and Machines.
Thank you, Giulia.
This was the last interview of this episode and the last episode in the season. Brains and Machines will start up again in the autumn, and one of the upcoming interviews will be with Carver Mead, father of neuromorphic engineering. We hope you will join us then.
That brings another episode of EE Times Current to its end. Thank you for listening, and thanks to our guests, Dr. Kenneth Stewart, Dr. Laura Kriener, Jens Pedersen, and Dr. Fabrizio Ottati. EE Times Current is available through the major podcast platforms, but if you get to us at our website at eetimes.com, you'll find the transcript, along with direct links to the other stories we've mentioned and other resources. EE Times Current is produced by EE Times. It was engineered by me, Taylor Marvin, at Coop Studios in Boulder, Colorado. The segment producer was Stephanie Munoz. Thanks for listening.